All right. Everybody's doing well? Fed? Caffeinated? Yeah? I don't know. I wasn't invited up there, Denise. Kind of cozy up there. Maybe I think maybe it's best I'm here. What do you think? I don't know. I kind of want to direct questions to you guys, right? Field questions from the audience. Hopefully they don't throw any tomatoes at you guys. All right. Well, good to see everybody. I'm not going to go into the bios just because they're in the packet, and I think most of the room knows most of the folks up here. But I will do a very quick and brief introduction of who our panelists are, and I think you'll see a logic behind why we selected this as the first panel to represent mainly the owners, some thought leadership, as well as some of the solutions that are being deployed in the field. And I'll start with Drew DeWalt, co-founder and COO of Rhumbix. I'll let him weave in what they do and the insights they've garnered during our Q&A. Obviously, Denise, who you just heard from. Maureen is global head of facilities for WeWork. Give us a bit of an insight that's also international, commonalities that they've seen, some of the great work that they've done on standardizing their own data process, the challenges in that, and really the investment levels required and the commitment to be able to even do that. Patrick Askew, our friend and faculty member here at Columbia and Executive Vice President of the New York City EDC. He has under his supervision and control roughly $5 to $9 billion in capital projects, and some really interesting ones, including the resiliency agenda for the city and the work not just on keeping our city moving and functional, but also about thinking how the future is going to impact our city. And lastly, Anil, who you've also heard from, that has just incredible history and background in the built environment, an academic, a practitioner. So yeah, we got what, 2 civil engineers, 2 commercial folk, and an architect, and me. All right, so let me start off with one question, and I'd like to sort of throw that question over to Drew, right? Let's start at the bottom of that pyramid, in the field. You've sort of come up with an approach to understanding what's happening in productivity, how to even capture that data. And the reason I'm starting with you is because Denise touched on an important conceptual idea, which is why is this for the Port Authority an imperative? Why is this important? I think it's important because we often forget at the program and enterprise level, we're buying jobs out project by project. They're not thinking, or at least they're not mobilizing their supply chain. Perhaps that's a structural issue in the market, in bulk purchasing, in large sort of strategic businesses and processes. So as you guys started to look at this issue in the field, can you share with us some of your experience, how you've evolved, what you've seen, and what data, because you're sort of now at the vector of that reporting. What have you seen, and what kind of pushback have you gotten, both from second tier, first tier, and GCs?
Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
I would say it's been a journey of sorts, and I've been at this for 6 years. Got into the construction industry via nuclear engineering in the Navy, into energy infrastructure development, into like actual construction. And our company's history, you know, the quick blurb, so I can get it passed, is basically all the mess of gathering information from the field across multiple stakeholders in a project. We clean all that up and structure it and get it to the right stakeholders. By focusing on workers first in the field, because that is the core of everything. Everything everybody wants, subcontractor, owner, PM, superintendent, general contractor, it's all the raw data is the same, and it's actually not even that complicated. The complexity comes across different stakeholder boundaries, different ways of gathering information, different people, and cleaning that up. But your question about how it's evolved, I mean, we started out, and you can imagine, especially in an environment like New York, we started out actually building wearable devices for construction workers, and we were tracking GPS location, 9-axis MEMS so that we would map. We actually have a patent for mapping general biomotion to specific construction activity and try to automate the whole thing. So it sounds great. It's a terrible idea. Because I think I think over time something like that becomes really, really interesting. But you have to build for the way construction operates now and help it move forward aggressively, right? And so I think the biggest change we've seen is really, I think, to get through this more quickly, I think the summaries as I've seen the industry changes as more technology has penetrated the construction industry, there's been this ironic effect where it has actually taken responsibility from the lowest levels and aggregated it at higher and higher levels, right? You used to have foremen and superintendents on construction jobs who knew cost and schedule, and they were running their own projects, and they knew all these things. And then as technology penetrated the market, it was sort of like, I just run crews. I'm the skill, and I do crappy paperwork because these aren't great tools for me, and somebody else is going to figure it out later, right? And so it affects timeliness of information, data quality. But we're seeing this trend the pendulum swinging back now, which is really exciting, where we understand that those skilled folks in the field, the people actually boots on the ground getting dirty, that is the key to it all. And me in an office somewhere, I can only help on the margins. And so how do we get that knowledge back into the field for better execution, and not just of the job itself and putting out the fire of having a successful job now, but actually structuring that information in a way that future projects are bid and scheduled and planned better so we can manage out more and more change over time, which doesn't happen right now in construction.
Thank you, Drew. So on that, Maureen, would you say that in many ways what WeWork's done and sort of the way that they're viewing it, and I know other owners are starting to view it this way, have kind of skipped the middle and gone straight into the source, into the field, gotten really involved into much of what Drew was describing and getting the intel from the frontline teams, not relying on their GCs and their contractors to report up, but rather shaping that reporting structure and tracking what is important for you guys to understand in terms of build-outs, in terms of time, in terms of streamlining?
Yeah, we've taken an approach where you have to look at the end-to-end. It comes back to Denise's comments on the experience, because ultimately there's a total cost of ownership for creating that business, and you have to look at what's your return once you've finally built that final product. And so by looking at the entire workflow from the conceptualization of what it is that you're trying to achieve in the business itself, and then building that out, the technologies you're using are only technology for technology's sake unless you figure out how each one of those components work together. And I think the description that you just said is like right on, because the problem is people bring pieces of technology to gather data, and taking that transparency to people who really need it, boots on the ground executing. So our approach is I think it's a hybrid mix between a lot of in-house expertise, leveraging very closely our strategic partners to get to market more quickly, to get the product up and built more quickly, and to use scale, and that's on a global basis. And if you look at just trends in general, when you look at the industry, it is, there's definitely movement that direction, but I guess this is my own thought, is ultimately, I think that technology right now, people aren't looking at it in kind of the areas that it should be. You look at that map with all those brands up there, and it's one thing to be looking at softwares and ERPs for how they're going to help you with your core business and the construction and the design information there. There's also the operational piece, which is so critical, and how do those operational components come together to help the facility operations once you've opened a site. And then the other piece is using some of the kind of innovative technology tools that are available during the construction piece itself. And unless you break those pieces down, it just becomes this amorphous technology approach, which unless you've got some really great roadmap and strategy about how you're going to use it, you can end up wasting a ton of time and a ton of money and end up with a lot of data that's completely useless. So you really need that strategy, and then how you're going to put data standards around the data you're collecting.
Okay, so in that vein, just to stay with you for a second, what would you recommend other owners that are your scale and size? Denise, as you sit down at a dinner table with Patrick, and you say, look, you know, we've had a little more flexibility in how involved we get down that you know, downstream. Here's what we've learned. Maybe these are some of the things you guys can think about. Perhaps it's, like you said, strategic mindsets. Perhaps it's thinking operational capabilities. Perhaps it's more tactical and on the ground in the field, which maybe is difficult for many owners whose core business isn't construction. Sure.
Could I add something? I think a lot of it is also compliance, because when you talk about different definitions, even for a closeout to one thing, one person means something to somebody else, and how you're capturing those dates, and what date are you actually talking about? So for us at the Port Authority, when we started putting in together a lot of, because you know, garbage in, garbage out, you could have the best systems, that if people aren't capturing the information correctly, then you don't really have the transparency, because the information is wrong. So what we needed to do is, one, we needed to look at what really technology we were looking at, and you're right, there's different technologies for different, there's different tools, and that's why we're a little fragmented right now, and I think the industry is fragmented, because there's not one tool that captures everything. But for design, we look at, we have a red flag alert program that we look at projects in design, and then or like we say, design and then construction, to track the schedules and milestones. But we also do a lot of teaching, or I would say classes, or training people so they understand, and not in design and in construction management, what we're trying to capture when we say this. Because when we go out and we're meeting with the chief engineer, the executive director, and something is a month late, we want to understand what's the contributor to that. So I think a lot of it is training people to understand what they're capturing. It's not just a project control specialist. The project manager has to understand that. It can't be all put on one person. And then also the construction manager, we have to deal with that, and also the contractor, because they're supposed to be giving us schedules. Are they real? Are we able to get those schedules? Are we inputting those schedules into our system? So there's like, the industry is fragmented, but I think as an owner, we have to make sure we have the compliance, that we're capturing the correct information. And then what we do is we meet internally, my staff, we meet monthly on the major, on all projects. We have 600 projects, we meet monthly, and we go through all the projects, you know, plan, present, forecast, where we are with that, and anything that's not meeting them within a 90-day period, we raise up and we meet with the chief engineer and the executive director, so they're very in tune to what's going on. So it's really important for us to make sure that we're capturing the correct information. And you know, and ultimately goes up to the governor. So
I think that based on Denise's comments, what I guess if I were to say one thing that I would say is really important in changing is that going back and just taking a step back and thinking about smart buildings. And we talk a lot about smart buildings and smart environments and space as a service and property as a service and what's happening in retail. And if you look across transportation or anything else, the processes haven't really changed a lot as far as what we're constructing, and unless we take a step back and start thinking about 5G. And what would it mean in new construction if a space is supposed to be much more enabled? So if you started looking, for example, at your distributed antenna system that you're going to put in a property, planning for that before you construct. So in speaking with a lot of different property owners, there are critical decisions, whether it's Amtrak, some of the very large developers. Do you go ahead and plan for fiber? So when you think about 5G, what it's going to bring to all business is, for example, this really incredible frequency, high frequency. But the enemy of high frequency is density. So going through walls. So if you're going to plan, you don't have to do it today, but planning for fiber, planning to enable some of the new types of technology that are going to change business, the way businesses operate, that would be something that I would really encourage people to think about, because to think of smart buildings or smart properties or smart space as an afterthought is it's a very expensive way, and it could be a real advantage to a developer or property owner if they've planned for that, because it's more attractive to a tenant or a business coming in.
You know, and that I think highlights a distinction between an owner like yourself and SL Green and others versus public sector owners or owners that have a service such as transportation deliver, because you have this tyranny of schedule and time, which is bounded by these contracts. And it's fascinating to hear us talk about this all the time, which is, you know, are we on schedule? What are the implications? What needs to be accelerated? versus maybe taking that step back and saying, okay, hold on a second, let's rethink this now. Are we pushing a schedule and undermining the end use of this product? And is that also having other effects on the supply chain? Patrick, and just to sort of put this over to you, because you deal with similar constraints and obviously also political cycles. The thing is, these projects are very long, and we have multiple governments in both state, federal, and even municipal that have to kind of, these projects have to live through. So there's these changes in strategies and impacts. But fundamentally, as a core capability for the future in both a team at the owner and deploying your programs, how do you view that? How do you view building that technology into it? And what do you decide of these 10 technology advances that Denise put up, what to focus on? What's the most impactful to you now? What can you socialize? What's worked? What takes longer time to work?
Wow, so that's a broad question. What we like to do, what I like to sort of focus on is codifying technology into our documentation. So it's important for me at my level in terms of delivering these major mega projects on the city level as the owner to put out RFPs that speak to addressing the technology needs. So I think that as an owner, it's important that it's not only in your role to oversee and deliver these projects, it's your role to institute and implement innovation into the market. So when I write contracts and when I write my RFPs, I'm incentivizing all of the industry to come in and give me their best technology, their best product delivery, whether it be through BIM, whether it be through LiDAR, whether it be through software. The way you write your request for proposals has to address the technology trends that's going on in the industry. And you have to incentivize the market to bring you the best skill sets in that. And you have to have a vision of how you want to see your project delivered in that regard. So there's a lot of, there's a number of RFPs and a number of different retainer contracts that we've just finished up over at the city that really is different. It really goes in a different direction in terms of what is traditionally known or traditionally done in construction. And we've gotten sort of responses back from the industry that really highlights how much technology is out there and how it's being implemented on these projects. And we do it through a system of just making sure that we cast a broad net in terms of technology, and we don't leave anything off the table. So that's our approach. Again, looking at different ways of codifying this information into RFPs, into contracts, along with looking at how you continue to standardize certain processes and not be afraid to take out certain traditional ways of how things were designed and built, looking at constantly changing standards in order to get your best product.
What would you say was the most useful, let's say 1, 2, 3 pieces that have weaved themselves into your practice, whether they've been reflected in the contracts or whether it has just been through the innovation or sort of creative approach of some of your contractors? What did they come to you and said, hey, we've implemented some of this technology in the field at the PMO, and you said, oh wow, this is really helpful. It's been really useful, and started to think about how you manage your program and your portfolios.
For me, I like to get into the weeds of some of the technology and spell out that information in the documents. So it's easy to talk about BIM and three-dimensional delivery of certain projects, but when you go into the fourth dimension, you want to be able to, in the actual RFP, spell out what does that actually mean. That means I want a cost-loaded schedule, and I want it to be, I want it to sort of be implemented, and I want it to flow down to every subcontractor and your providers and your manufacturers and your suppliers. I spell out exactly how I want the technology to be implemented in the RFP and in the contract. I leave them no room to question what I'm looking for. And it's important. And if you need to get into the weeds with some of this technology, if I want to tell them I want you to do radar of the utilities prior to you doing a survey or handing over a survey, I want to understand that you've scanned the entire site so I understand what my risks are prior to doing any excavation. I'm specific about the technology I want you to use, how I want you to use it, and why I want you to use it. And if they can deliver on that, I'm willing to pay a premium to deliver that project with that technology.
Okay. Very interesting. How much of this, and to just, I want to very briefly take this to kind of an international level. And Anil, I'll start with you and then Maureen, because I think the two of you are well positioned to talk a little bit about what we've seen. I mean, obviously the Scandinavians and the Japanese have been doing off-site and modular construction for decades. Other markets, and also the possibility of economic development and the impact of firms, countries that have not yet sort of tied down to our process and are integrating some of the new technologies into their economic development cycle. What have you seen internationally that has worked, either whether it's culturally, tone from the top, and owners directing specifically what technologies like Patrick highlighted, or whether it's like Denise, owners really building their own homegrown capabilities? What's happening out there in the world outside of New York?
Sure. Francisco, the first thing I specifically want to tell you is that these chairs are very comfortable. But having worked in the construction market and sort of had discussions in areas like New Delhi, I've worked in Sydney, I've worked in the Phoenix market, I think the excitement, the challenges, and the opportunities are the same when it comes to applying technology in the construction sector. And that, to me, is personally the most exciting thing. It's not like replacing a work center in a factory and getting improvements in your factory. It's much more challenging, and therefore it's much more exciting, and therefore provides much more opportunity. So I see with this globalization, similar kind of activity happening in most markets when it comes to technology applications in the construction sector. And I'm seeing more and more involvement of owners. I remember doing a project in New Delhi about 5 years ago where we utilized, with the help of my students, laser scanning for looking at urban renewal at a 100-acre existing community for one of the largest developers in India. And initially it was about technology, but once we delivered some good output, it became about people. So the community came, saw what was being displayed in like the digital model that Denise had shown, and it all became about people and practices. So I think that's really where we also start to think and shift our focus. It's not really the technology that's important, it's the final outcome and convincing the folks that are involved in that kind of an experiment. The couple other things I'd like to add from Denise's presentation, I picked up talent, which she said. The second thing I picked up was standards and compliance. And from Maureen's discussion, I picked up what she said to me is a life cycle thinking, which I'm a civil engineer. I think of a project in terms of time, cost, quality, safety, and maybe sustainability. But I think we need to change our thinking and do exactly what Maureen said. It's an asset that we're going to be delivering that's going to be used by the end user. So can the design and construction process also take that worldview of life cycle thinking and do things in a better way? So as RICS, we address the two issues that Denise picked up, which were talent. We set globally, and this is our international experience, education and qualification standards. So if we see good things in the market, we get market insights and try to create documents, standards, and training that actually then impacts our 130,000 members globally. Being an organization that's 150 years old, we have a good way of communicating with our members and taking those standards and those education and qualification standards into the marketplace, helping not only universities, but also professionals in the industry individually to come up to speed with these global best practices. On international standards and compliance, I think that's one of the key things that RICS does, and we produce for recently, we have released what's called the International Construction Measurement Standard, which is a high-level standard that helps organizations, especially owners and project sponsors in the public sector, report, classify cost data in a high-level, internationally agreed format, not just for construction, but for renewal, for operation, for maintenance, and for end-of-life costs. So I think through these standards, their compliance and regulation, education and qualification standards, we can take all these international learnings and good practices and mainstream that. And that has been one of the passions that I personally have, taking exemplar projects, demo projects, pilot projects, and putting them into mainstream on our projects so that our assets that are delivered are really high quality and work for the end users.
I don't know if I can comment on what I've heard here is I think we've got to acknowledge, right, I'm struck with, I think all these perspectives are right, but I'm struck with how much the construction industry is just a mishmash of contradictions all the time, right? We've talked about collaboration and standards and trying to drive this, but owners here at the table are the key to unlocking the future of the industry and driving these standards and driving a better industry, but they're also, it's a double-edged sword because they can be exacerbators of the problems, right? If every owner has a different standard, then there is no standard for anybody. And so that's the trouble, and as a software provider trying to provide for this industry, it's tough because construction's very unique. All the folks who have been able to drive this process, we talk about manufacturing, we talk about other industries who have taken advantage of the opportunity that data provides and machine learning and quantum computing, but they don't have the problems that construction has because they are all their own entity. It's all their own data, right? Construction is the epitome of collaboration across contractual boundaries, across stakeholders, and it should be this collaborative effort, and yet we do all these things to segment and put things in buckets and push risk around, and we don't take this life cycle approach, not just to construction, but the asset itself, right? And so then it pushes these solutions that we're trying to use on different projects to solve for a specific stakeholder, right? And I think, Patrick, you're right, and I love the way you write RFPs, but this idea that I can dictate the right way to do my job and then via an RFP process without being in a conversation with how does this solve for your problem as a general contractor on my job, and then how does this solve for a subcontractor on my job so that we can all deliver this project together, right? Because that is the thing is I build software, we talked about some software, it's built for an owner, and then it delivers value for an owner, and a GC and a sub hates using it, right? Or I build something for a subcontractor, doesn't deliver value here, and nobody seems to be at scale asking the questions of, okay, this helps me, but how does this help the other stakeholders on my projects? And this view from an owner perspective changes everything, but it doesn't happen all the time.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, take the Port Authority, right? So the Port Authority is a Revit. We use Revit, right? MTA uses Bentley. So think about that. Think about, I'm not talking about contractors, but think about, well, even contractors, because if you want to put, or subs, so then you have to have Bentley and Revit, right? I mean, that's, a big investment. So for the Port Authority, one of the things I'm doing is a 21st century council. I asked my staff, set up a committee, because we want to do a think tank. What software do we currently have, all right? What software works? What software doesn't work? I mean, think about the investment we made 30 years of all the technology. And then think about where we're going to go. And you're right, there's a lot of fragmentation. But from an owner, which is different from a lot of the consultants and contractors, you walk away. And as Maureen said, we own the asset. So how do we, as owners, we're looking at Maximo right now because we're looking at asset management. And we're looking at all our assets, and we're looking at barcoding them and just using them so we could have a capital program based on the asset's deterioration or where we have to put into capital planning. So we're looking at that, but I don't really think, and I challenge you guys, I don't think the industry is there yet. I wish you'd have one thing where I could do schedules and earn value and Revit, and it's just, and we need to think differently and create differently. It's a challenge for us as owners because we want to invest in what is the right type of software. You know, because you have Oracle, you have eBuilder, I can go on, all the different, and then the same thing in the construction tools.
Well, and I think that raises a, I think we all know what some of these issues are, and the structure and the contractual structure will dictate incentives. You know, traditionally, if you just take contract manufacturing, most of the innovation is happening at the contractor level, at the manufacturer level, whether it's homegrown or abroad. We unfortunately don't have that. Razor-thin margins, contractors, really doesn't allow for an investment into their own R&D and building of capabilities. We're so market-driven that we expect that the market, somebody, some magical invisible hand in the market will provide that solution, much like what Drew and others in the Procore and Rhumbix have done. And at the owner's side, it's we got to get this done so we can get this operating. So traditionally, we've seen this, I would say, within what we call the tier one, the prime contractor coming up with this, except they function much more like a supply chain manager and contract administrators. So it's left to Patrick having to specify because he's not getting this upstreamed to one from one. And I'm talking about this market, right? We have more markets that are a little more ahead, some more behind. So I'm really just talking about New York. And then we have other issues where you deal with this enormous aggregation of money and interfaces at EDC and Port Authority where, hey, man, I just need a simple dashboard so I can track this stuff and know what to push, where to pull. So is there a way to incentivize the contractor? You said it interestingly that you're willing to pay a premium for that. What does that look like? So with that, I'm going to, one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Anybody want to take that?
I think, listen, fragmentation in the industry is nothing new. The reality of it is that that's one of the oldest challenges we have in this industry, getting the high-level CM services to communicate and to work in a collaborative way with all the other phases and sub-consultants and subcontractors and use collaborative software and things of that nature. The reality of it is that if we, from my perspective, and you know, I think there's different positions to take on this, obviously, but when you integrate this into the highest levels of your RFPs and your contracts and spell out how you want each component of this project to be delivered, all the way down to the manufacturer, you are in some ways mitigating some of the fragmentation in terms of delivering the project. So I know that you can't do that for every project, and there's software out there and there's technology out there that are competing with different industry technology. But for me, if you want to do work with the city, if you want to build something on my platform, this is how you're going to have to invest in working for me. The MTA and the Port Authority may have a different approach on how you need to invest in working for them, and businesses will make that decision from a business standpoint on how much they want to invest in working for these mega agencies. But there's value in working for the Port Authorities, value in working for the MTA. They do billions and billions and billions of dollars in work. So you have to invest in my process. That's how I see it. You will invest in my process, or you might want to go build someplace else.
I just have one thought that I would suggest. I spent 20 years prior to joining on the corporate side working for service providers. So whether it's CBRE or JLL, working globally with hundreds and hundreds of clients, corporate side and institutional side, the one lesson that you take away as a service provider is that the idea of being closed, proprietary, when something's really nascent and it's super fragmented, that's really powerful. But when you start realizing that everyone needs something and you need to share, and we're in a sharing economy, it's really short-sighted because you might win in the short term, but you're going to be completely obsolete in the long term. So the idea today of having something that's not open, that you can't share your data, that you're not willing to partner more with others, that might win you the next couple of gigs or jobs, and you're trying to keep your margin low, and you've got, the winning solution. But I think overall, currently, I really like to spec that things need to be open, shared, easily integratable. I really care about the functionality of what data is being collected, so dates, compliance, but as long as it can go into a data cube, that I can take that out and use it the way I want, that's really important. And I believe that the operations side has struggled for many years with many of the same things at construction. And what's going to happen is if we really do start looking at that end-to-end, some of these learnings and operations is going to flow back through into construction, and it won't put too much onus on one company to try to reinvent the wheel that every other company is doing. So I think sharing is the key.
Well, I'm not surprised that WeWork's figuring it out, right? Because the irony is that the shorter term projects cannot have a short term view because they're happening so fast. You have to have the longer term of how do we get it's so iterated that you have to get better faster. And the flip side is major capital projects that are 3, 5, 7 years actually have the shortest term view of anybody. They write contracts for the project. Let's get this project done. Let's put out this fire. And there's no incentives to solve longer term issues. And I think that's, Patrick, like some of this I'd love to see is contracts that incentivize some of those longer term behaviors, right? There's conversation around, I wish I had the data, if only had the data and the dashboard. But then like to actually get structured data that you could use to inform future projects takes a lot of work, which means cost, which means resource. And we're not willing to allocate those resources to this project for the enterprise view of how do we get better over time. And maybe that's an opportunity.
And yeah, even to think about integrating some of that and having the designers, the architects, the engineers, and the CMs and consultants to essentially just start owning a big part of that as well and helping that knowledge transfer and really sort of thinking through the design. Not design in terms of architectural design or engineering, but really designing the project strategy with these elements. So with that, I'd like to open it up. Questions? Alan, first up. No, do we not have a mic?
An extra one.
There is a mic on the floor.
Here you go.
Oh, he's got one. Oh, you got the next
An
one?
extra one.
Thank you.
We got some technology issues here.
Okay. Hopefully you can hear me now. Thank you, Fran. I just wondered, from an international perspective, there is evidence that certain, if you like, interference in the market does work because of the fragmentation of the construction industry. And certainly the UK experience was that a level 2 mandate for BIM was a seminal moment in terms of take-up in the industry. And in fact, the standards that go with the implementation of building information modeling as well. So I just wondered, because we've got some strong owner representation on the panel, what are their thoughts about trying to lobby the state or even the federal government in terms of nudging the market? Because I realise government intervention is not that popular in the US. So what about trying to encourage a more top-down approach to the introduction of technology into your projects for the benefit of whole society?
We typically leave that kind of advocacy to organizations like IFMA, BOMA, so because you have to have like shared interests, and so for one group to be going specifically into the government to lobby, we do believe that many of the different associations and groups, like for example RICS, the need for standards is absolutely critical. And whether you talk about OSCAR for data standards, the work that RICS does with OSCAR, there are so many opportunities right now when I talk about collaboration, and I believe that it's that need that is giving a new life to a lot of these industry associations and groups, because there's an affinity that they share that does not, it's like friendly co-opetition where there's a shared need. And I think some of the education that these groups also bring of why it's important and what these exist. You can go, some people don't even know what BIM is and how it's utilized, much less that you can use it, everything from the design and construction then on into operations, and the importance that that can bring. There's tremendous cost savings from utilizing that all the way through the life cycle. So education is key, and then uptake and adherence. And I do believe that one of the huge benefits that technology is bringing, technology is something that just can enable things that we're doing in a very smart way, if we use it that way. But what we, I think, are finally getting our heads around is if the data that is being collected is basically being collected there that you can use it for a very long time, it's not just for that moment. The only ability to do that would be through shared open platforms and standards, and I think that's why you're beginning to see massive different type of benchmarking exercises. And exercises, you look at a company like VTS and the amount of information it's been able to take up on lease abstracting and data, because people are understanding the power of that. And so I think given the U.S. and much more about just, you know, the way we kind of operate as a, you know, basically the country runs, it's through that advocacy that's probably more important, but you're beginning to see much more shared interest, I believe.
And I would say you are seeing some of that with agency level. DDC has this sort of quasi-BIM mandate for their projects. What Patrick described is sort of a tech mandate. It's unfortunately not as centralized as the UK. We talked about this yesterday, and it's interesting what role government, regulation, municipal, state in this country, industry, IFMA, and so on and so forth can help. And I do think, from my experience, and you probably agree, that tone from the top matters, and I think that can help drive and accelerate much of this.
Can I add one? On the international standards point of view, I mean, there's some activity in the US as well. I think the International Alliance for Interoperability, which is now building smart, and the IFC standards are a great example of how industry can come together and create something that hopefully in the short term can overcome this issue of Revit versus Bentley and different BIM authoring tools. So there's a definite role, and I think you're spot on, that it's probably a not-for-profit public good entity like RICS that can take on the issue of standards development. But mind you, that cannot take place in a vacuum. It has to be with the help of industry experts. So our individual professional members will have to help us develop those standards outside of their company boundaries.
Perfect. Tessa.
Tessa Lau, Destiny Robotics. So I think the reason we're all here is because we're trying to figure out how do we get adoption of innovation more into this industry. But I think one of the big challenges is that you know, the age of the industry, the conventions, the institutions like unions and the way contracts are structured make it very difficult to adopt new innovation. And so I'm wondering what strategies you guys have discovered or recommend that would help organizations like yourselves adopt more innovation.
The one thing I like to see is for us to start at the education level and start integrating some of this information, innovation into the education of our engineers and construction professionals. To be honest with you, I take a risk-based management approach to delivering all of my projects. That's an entire philosophy on how to design and build projects. And I didn't really touch risk until I went to graduate school. That is a mistake. Engineers and architects and construction professionals need to start understanding how to manage risk of construction in their undergrad level to understand how projects are delivered. And I get that you want to focus on your fundamentals at that level, but at the same time, I think there is a lack of, and there's a gap between what talent is coming out currently and what the industry is doing. And we have to fill that gap by changing our academic sort of providers and standards and introducing new ways of designing and building projects that are current with the way things are. And I think that's one of the ways we can sort of close that gap, to be honest with you.
I think on a personal observation, I think we have reached an inflection point. I'm a professor and I have a theory. It's called the bitter pill theory. So earlier in my conversation, say 5 years ago, if I went to a trade contractor in Phoenix and tried to sell a software that I had made, it was literally painful. It means you could see the pain in the room. Why are you making me adopt technology? It's a bitter pill that I don't. I think that has changed. There is a pull now from the industry, especially from the owners, large owners, to see how they can bring changes in their business processes, practices, with the help of technology. And I think that has largely come because technology has impacted the society in general. So my end users, like Denise had pointed out, the riders on the transit use technology so that when they try and interface and see that the assets are not up to date in that technological framework, I think that change, I feel personally, has happened, and we have many technology experts in the room today. Like to hear from them. Are they seeing that positive inflection that has taken place?
Thank you, Anil. We've got about 10 minutes left. I do want to get through as many questions as possible. So just to keep the answers tight. Back there, yes, sir?
Denise, you spoke of the need to educate people about the data that you need to collect. My question is, presumably a lot of that data needs to come from third parties, and their contractual and legal interests might lead them to want to skew the data. So how do you counter that and account for how it might skew your data?
Well, if we're talking about a project, right? We're talking about a project? All right, so there are project managers, right? Should have boots on the ground and know where the project is. And they should be able to read, to assess the information that they're collecting from third parties and forecast and plan. So, like I said, that as long as the information is transparent and people are seeing it in real time, so one of my construction inspectors are seeing it at the same time, let's say a designer is seeing it, or the construction manager, then and if there is an issue, they should be able to raise it. You know, some things we won't be able to see, but it should be viewed. The information is there. It's how we retrieve it and get it back to us. So I think it's very, very doable, even third-party information.
I might add that also could constitute fraud and
Right.
fraudulent behavior that could land folks in. Yeah, it's a very interesting question.
I'd take a different view. I think no matter what you do, you're going to get skewed information almost, because even if everybody's an honest actor, they want to tell you the truth. Everybody at every level is using different systems to pass information from paper to systems, and everybody wants to paint a slightly more optimistic picture of what's going on at my level when I pass it up. And when you aggregate optimism up to the top, everybody's well-intentions looks like a lie, right? And so it's really hard to do unless you can get everybody in a system that benefits everybody in a system, which hasn't been done yet. So you're trying to get, and that's why it's the long-term view, the iterated game. Can we get close, and then can we dial it in on the next project and the next project, which is why you have to take a more portfolio view to how you do things as opposed to just a myopic view on the project.
And could I add one thing, just one thing? And what we're training our staff to be is not optimistic, but we're training them to be realistic.
Well, that's motivated.
It's not hard for New Yorkers. Yes, sir, over there.
Morning all, David Green, Turner and Townsend. Just a quick question around, or quick observation really, one around sort of how budgets are captured. What I see mainly in public organisations really doesn't drive that life cycle idea around CapEx and OpEx budgets. I think that's something as an industry, sort of what I've seen worldwide, we always struggle on to understand. You're spending more today, but you're going to save more in the future. Doesn't always fit in the capital plan that gets published, and making sure you fit within that sort of remit. And I think that's something as agencies and the industry we need to look at, and sort of, as for me as a consultant, is to look to try and help explain that to the stakeholders within these agencies, as that you are going to get the benefit, and understanding how you and demonstrate that benefit at the point in time so that people buy into it. And I think another reason around sort of driving sort of new ideas into the industry from the contractor is around a lot around how we set up our risk profile and how we transfer risk, especially around some of the mega projects. There is a tendency to push all the risk onto the contractor, and ultimately I ultimately see the client owns 100% of the risk 100% of the time, because ultimately if that project goes late, it's the client that doesn't get their asset delivered. If it goes over budget, the contractor goes bust and the client ultimately fails. So I think around risk, I think would also sort of having more of a discussion around risk transfer maybe would encourage contractors to take more risks, because it's a benefit to both the client and themselves to drive efficiencies and drive productivity, which they could share with the client. And it's like around the world, they use pain gain mechanisms, where if you come in under budget, you use actual cost, and you come in under budget and you share the saving. But if you go over, you share the pain. And that also gives you great data for future, because you're looking at actual cost when you're looking to drive future projects and learning, rather than, say, a fixed price contract where you pay what you pay on a line item that you don't know whether that's what it costs.
So yeah, let me just take this briefly. I think this is it's a big bucket, and one that I think is influenced as much by contract structure and behavior and culture. Question, I think, is how technology can help in part of that process. But I did want to keep it focused to sort of technology and applications of technology and what we're seeing in the field. I would say one thing, and this sort of is my personal position, and that ultimately contractors and subcontractors, they're essentially in this market to present themselves as experts. This is their business. So one end of it, as an owner, I'd say, well, level up, because if you can't get up to speed with what I need or compete with the rest, then I'm going to go find that contractor that can deliver, who's willing to internalize that risk and deliver because they've built that capability to manage that risk. And if they can't, they shouldn't be entering into contracts they know they can't deliver on. So I think this is a difficult conversation and one that I think we know that these risks are difficult to parse out. And owners too, perhaps, like you're saying, need to internalize much of that risk in project delivery. Any questions over on this end? Yes, sir. Right there, right there in the front. No, yeah. All right.
Hi, I'm Jose Ramos. I'm an architect from San Juan, Puerto Rico. I got my son in Columbia University, studying computer science instead of architecture like me, but...
Well, Port Authority and EDC is hiring, and I think Rhumbix is hiring.
Yes, I have a small question. Talking about the development of small business and integrate the small business to these networks, intelligent networks, that make more effective the construction industry. I got an observation. Software is very easy to obtain or to pay for them, but get access to the platforms of like these models that I saw in the presentation is sometimes not affordable to small business, and they need some leverage to get access to the platform, that in the future these platforms are able to implement artificial intelligence to be more effective and have more control of the business of construction.
I'm really glad you brought that up. You know, in the fog of this excitement, we sort of forgot to touch on this, and thank you for bringing this up. We've got a few minutes, but I'd love your perspectives of how can we help support small businesses. I think it's an opportunity of small, medium-sized businesses and MWBs to perhaps leapfrog and enter part of the market where they've otherwise been shut out. And maybe each one of you can provide a quick perspective on that, a quick highlight.
We have, the Port Authority has rebranded itself and has a big diversity and inclusion push and a diversity and inclusion office. We're working with small businesses to actually educate and train them on the use of building information modeling and CAD and helping to support them. Because what the thing is we want is SBEs and MWBEs to joint venture and actually become primes on our projects. So we have a big push for that. We do use BIM, but not all the small projects are using. We don't use it on all projects, so it's not the expected. But we are, like I said, working closely with small business enterprises to make sure that trying to gear them to be primes on our projects. And I could talk to you afterwards if you like. Okay.
If you can't reform, replace.
Well, to the extent that I again codify this information into our RFPs, into our contracts, it's a pass-through in some instances. So we recognize that Primavera is extremely expensive, and there are a lot of people out there that are small businesses and they want to be a part of these projects. So in a lot of ways, in our contracts, when we talked about the premium we are willing to pay, that's one of them. There's a pass-through cost for these MWBEs using this type of technology on behalf of the owner. So at EDC, we recognize that as a sort of a challenge, and we set up types of ways that we subsidize the technology within our agreements. That's very important on our end, because you really can't, expect sort of MWBEs or smaller, companies to, support that level of technology that you're asking for at the same time when the project's gone. They're out of pocket. So we recognize that.
Yeah, I also think that technology, particularly in the operating side, when you think about procurement, there was so much about big buys and leverage and scale, and you end up, having massive buys with very, very large organizations. But the beauty of some of the newer technologies, particularly distributed procurement, has allowed organizations to engage thousands and thousands of small suppliers in local communities, vet them really quickly, and pull them into the network. And so I see some of the advances, particularly in sourcing and aggregation, is actually really changing the game. And I think most organizations, when you look at the commitment to diversity and inclusion, it's not just in the supplier engagement, but it's also in the end user. Because the design in general has always been for a standard for like a normal person, and it really, people are all different. They're tall, they're short, they've got challenges, physical challenges, and so to include the thoughts of those things also into design as far as that end experience is also critically important, and again, through design involving smaller firms. So I'm seeing a massive change in that, and I do think technology, open platforms, open technologies, and more softwares as a service, as opposed to having to invest in an ERP, is changing the game.
Sure.
You're a small, medium, getting big, unicorn soon.
Don't throw that around. It's not a compliment at times. My only answer is the thing I've seen is that most construction contractors, not even SMBs, don't know how to buy software at scale, right? It's like, I want to buy it, I'm not sure how to buy it, and I got to figure out the line item and cobble it together, and is it a G&A or is it on a project? The thing is it's essentially, most people put in G&A and overhead, but it should be a project cost. It's part of the execution piece. And so as a small business, as long as you're executing projects, you should be able to pay for software because it's helping you execute the business. But a lot of business we work with don't actually realize you can do that.
Good. Anil, and we'll close it up with you.
Sure. So I got two theories. No, I'm just kidding.
Just short theories, not the academic theories.
Yeah, I know. So I think Uber. If you got a car, you're safe, secure, clean car, generally, you can participate in this tremendous model and start earning money. So similar access to software platforms eventually, I think, is going to make it easier for technology, other players, smaller players to participate as well. And secondly, I think it goes back to data, information, and awareness. And what you are leading, Francisco, at Columbia, the Construction Diversity Institute, can do or initiative, can do tremendous things in terms of providing the real data. Is there gaps in terms of doing BIM training, P6 training, or providing access to software? Is there a need for certain kind of groups or networks to come together to participate in a larger project? So I think it's really thinking about the future in terms of the various platforms other sectors of the economy are using, and secondly, doing what universities and professional bodies are good at, and that's spreading the right information, bringing awareness, and getting data. I think without data, if we keep making gestures, it may not have the right impact. So having these three pieces together through CDI, which you are leading, I think would be amazing, especially for this market.
Thank you, Neil. And to close off, Maureen, you reminded me of something Lindsay McComb introduced to us around a really innovative procurement coupling up in England around public sector work and ensuring that they're sort of flexing to bring in 20 to 30% of SMEs into that procurement chain. So there's definitely other folks around the world doing some fascinating stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. And with that, we're going to pass it on to our second session.